Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell and your true crime, real crime fix, where you get insight and analysis and expert opinion about cases, but also I centre victims and I want to make sure they don't become footnotes, and I also want to highlight intervention and prevention opportunities. And that's what sets Crime Analyst apart. So if you haven't subscribed just yet, what are you waiting for? Please hit subscribe so that you don't miss out on future content. Do take a listen to my podcast, Crime Analyst. I deep dive lots of different cases and really get into the nuance, detail and context of behaviour. So do take a listen. I'm still headlong in the Murdoch case. There is so much to unravel. It really is an unbelievable case for so many reasons. So do take a listen to that. And I'm dropping on YouTube as well. And do take a listen to my other podcast, Real Crime Profile. We have just dropped a special episode on the case that I want to talk about today. It's a case that's been in the news headlines non-stop, and there's so much that I could say about it, but I want to really ensure that the victims are centred, and I want to focus on some of the lessons, some of the intervention and prevention opportunities about men like this, and also about the victims who are targeted and the investigation. So if you're sitting comfortably, I want to go back to 2010. So going back to 2010, Shannon Gilbert, who was working as a prostitute, she vanished, and there was an investigation into her disappearance. And what happened months later was that a police officer was doing a training exercise with his dog in December. And he was conducting this training exercise along Ocean Parkway in Gilgo Beach. And they came across a set of human remains. And the human remains were identified as Melissa Barthelemy. They continued to search, and days later, 3 other sets of human remains were found. And they are the remains of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. So utterly horrific. Really horrific for their families. The fact that they had been missing for some time and that it was skeletal remains that were found tells you that the person who put their remains there did not want them to be found. So that's important, as is the victimology. And you'll hear me say time and time again, victimology is so important. A particular victim is chosen at a particular time for a particular reason at a particular location. Now, all of these women shared in common that they were petite, so they were small. They were aged between 22 and 27, so they were young looking. They were prostitutes. They would visit clients. They all were contacted by a burner phone before they went missing. They were found in a particular location, just feet from the water, and they were missing their clothes and their personal possessions. They had been bound and wrapped with belts and tape, and 3 of them were wrapped in burlap type material. Now that's a type of fabric, and it was a camouflage type of fabric. So these are very important points when thinking about the case back in the day, and what it reveals is that this was the work of one perpetrator. How they were found, where they were found, the fact that they were human remains, i.e. they remained hidden for some time, that tells you that the person who did it was criminally sophisticated, that they were meticulous in their planning and how they were carrying this out. These are all very important points because the victimology holds up a mirror to the perpetrator. The fact they were contacted by someone with a burner phone, well, again, these are all lines of investigation that should have been followed up on, but they weren't, unfortunately. And the case remained cold, and other human remains were found in and around Gilgo Beach. Now that's also important. So fast forward to 2022, and a task force was formed in January. Now that task force was made up of the FBI and police investigators and analysts, and within 2 months, so by March, they had identified a suspect. That suspect is now in police custody, and he's been charged with 3 of the murders. So he's been charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman and Amber Costello, and it's believed that other charges will follow. But what's important about the case is that within 2 months, seasoned investigators and analysts identified this individual. And they spent a lot of time investigating him from that moment onwards. And I've read the bail application. It's 32 pages long. It details a very extensive investigation. And that extensive investigation covered more than 300 subpoenas and search warrants. And it included things like the cell phone billing records, his burner phones. There were 7 burner phones. And those burner phones were used to contact 3 out of the 4 victims. And he had numerous Tinder profiles using different names with different phones and different email accounts attached. And on his computer search history, there were thousands of searches. Searches on sadistic and torture pornography, on children, on women, really horrific things, 10-year-old girls, schoolgirls, just very sadistic in nature. And that's important to understand, as well as there were many searches on the task force and the work that they were doing, and searches including things like, why would law enforcement not be able to trace calls by the Long Island serial killer? So very specific things. There were also searches on the victims, and these searches were extensive. So that's important. All of this information and evidence, it takes time to subpoena, first of all, and to obtain, and then it takes time to analyse, and the timeline takes time to go through. And I'm going through the timeline, the micro timeline and the macro timeline in the murders of Maggie and Paul. And the timeline work is just so resource intensive, particularly when you have a lot of data. And there was a huge amount of data in this case. There was also DNA. And that DNA, what they found were there were a number of hairs that through mitochondrial DNA profiling that they linked to Rex Heuermann's wife. Now, those hairs were hers, but we know through the task force work that she was out of town at the times those murders occurred. So he waited for his wife to go out of town with the children to Iceland and to Maryland and New Jersey, and then he would commit his offences. And I'm going to talk more about that. But it's important to think about the DNA evidence. The fact that there were hairs belonging to his wife, well, I have a theory about that I may share later on. There was one hair that was found that was related to male DNA. In January, they found a discarded pizza box, and that was rushed to the lab to compare against this hair. And in June, they discovered that it was a match, and he was then arrested on July the 13th. When he was arrested, he had one of the burner phones on him that related to one of the email accounts, the Thork account. So again, tying things in and corroborating information and evidence is really important. Now, he does deny that this is him, and he cried in custody. I believe that to be some poor me syndrome, which I see a lot, particularly with serial perpetrators and particularly when there's psychopathy. It's highly contagious, poor me syndrome. And the symptoms and the onset of those symptoms are very acute at the point of accountability. And that's what I'm seeing here, which again matches with what I find with a lot of these perpetrators who are very controlled, but up until the point where they are arrested or they feel some form of accountability coming, then they develop some form of illness where they might need a walker or a wheelchair. But there's certainly this large element of trying to get himpathy, which is unique for men. And we mustn't fall into that trap. It's another manipulation that psychopaths use to try and control us. Now, I haven't diagnosed this individual, by the way, but I do believe there are some psychopathy traits. Now, when we think about who he is, there's a lot of people saying they're really shocked by the fact that he's an architect and that he's an older man, he's now 59, that he's married and he has 2 children. And I am not shocked by that at all. And I think the fact that he's married with 2 children, I've talked about this numerous times. You see men hiding behind what they think is this cloak of respectability and credibility. By being married, they feel that it insulates them from people looking at them as risky and dangerous. But we really shouldn't look at them as being a family man, therefore not risky, because some of these men are incredibly dangerous. And I've seen it in my research at New Scotland Yard. I reverse engineered and profiled 452 dangerous and violent. And when I use the word violent, I mean controlling as well, not just physical abuse, but violent men backwards, looking at everything that they've done within their relationship, their significant relationship, and outside that relationship. And I found that 1 in 8 of them were serial perpetrators and very dangerous. 1 in 8. And that was really before we were talking about coercive control. But coercive control is a very important component here. It's the need and the desire to entrap and exploit and dominate and have the power and control over. And I believe that that's what this individual is about. When we think about the psychopathology and the fact that this is about sexual sadism. And how do we know it's about sexual sadism? Well, we know it through the binding and through the tying, but also the sadistic porn. The fact that it was younger girls and women that he was looking at in those searches. The fact that we have a number of victims here who are petite and they look young, so the targeting of them specifically. So we have to think about the fact also that 2 of the victims' family members were contacted afterwards. Their phones were used after they were killed. The perpetrator used the phone, and it was a form of sadistic taunting. This is unusual again, but it talks to psychopathology, that sadism, that stalking behaviour, the predatory stalking behaviour that I talked about with Colin Pitchfork and other perpetrators like Levi Belfield. And I'm going to talk about them again in a minute. So let's think about the fact that he's an architect and that he lived in this sort of suburb where he's married with 2 children. And I watched quite a lot of the interviews of neighbours saying things like, oh, we're really shocked. It's such a shock that this has happened in our quiet neighbourhood. And he was a quiet family man. And I just want to say, first of all, for me, that is really interesting to hear. And it's red flag and red flag again. So the fact that they're shocked, yes, people don't believe serial killers live and eat and breathe amongst us. Well, they do. Psychopaths live and eat and breathe amongst us. Okay, and they can wear this mask externally. And sometimes we see leakage. But I think what's really important is that he bought that house that is dilapidated and hasn't received much love and care and attention, and it's outdated. And he bought that house, it's his childhood house, that he obviously felt very comfortable in that area. And that's obviously why he wanted to stay there in terms of his offending behaviour. He could dispose of the bodies. He could leave the bodies somewhere and not be out of place. And he knows that area incredibly well. And also the fact that people weren't saying that they knew a lot about him. They said that the family were very quiet. They kept themselves to themselves. Well, if we flip that on its head, what that means is they were isolated. They didn't know other people. So that, again, is very important to me. You know, with a family, and I know this myself, living, when you have young children or children, you have to integrate and you have to have other people that you're talking with and you're socialising your children with. So it's highly unusual when you hear that a family are isolated in a suburb like this. And actually, most people didn't know him at all. So that, again, is a red flag for me, and it talks to isolation. That doesn't talk to, this is such a shock that he did this, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about his behaviours, his creepy behaviours, his inappropriate behaviours, his bullying behaviours, the fact that he has a short fuse at times, and he feels, because he's 6'4", and he feels because he's such a big mass, he's a very big guy, he's been described as an ogre, that he feels that his physical stature is enough that people won't challenge him. And I'm sure that he would use that at times. But to some, he might seem quiet and socially awkward. But we'll hear more about what other women have to say, because there will be other encounters where near misses, where women got away. And the fact that he's married with 2 children, I think that he most likely believed that that insulated him from being suspected. And so many men use that. And I'm here to say that we have to think about these men who are controlling in their lives. As an architect, he's probably very meticulous and controlling in what he does. But ironically, his house was dilapidated and outdated. He's not putting that love and care and attention and thought into his home and into his family. So that tells me that he doesn't value them. What he's spending his time doing is the researching, the Googling, the searches, the looking at porn, the Tinder profiles, having these 7 burner phones. That's what he spends his time doing. And I'm sure that there will be other storage facilities. There'll be the fact that there was a concealed room in the basement. That doesn't surprise me at all. We know from cases like Jerry Brudos, who was also married, that his wife was told she couldn't go into certain areas of the house. He had a cellar as well. There were rules and regulations she had to abide by. She had to vacuum just wearing stilettos. There were certain rules laid down. And I've seen that in most serial killer cases. When they are married or they have relationships, there are rules, coercive and controlling behaviors and rules and regulations that if they're broken, there's a consequence. So, and I'm thinking about cases like Levi Belfield. He was abusive to multiple women that he had relationships with. And he was also going out targeting women who looked just like the women who he had relationships with. And I'm also thinking about Peter Tobin, who did exactly the same thing, a particular type of victim. But the women that he married 3 times, he was very abusive to, coercively controlling. In fact, one of the women, Margaret, he almost killed. And then you have Dennis Rader. And I've been listening to his daughter, Kerry Rawson, who's incredibly brave and courageous, speaking out about the impact of finding out that your dad is a serial killer. Well, I know that case well, and I also know he was very coercively controlling. He wanted the blades of grass to be a certain measurement. So that level of control in your home life, that bleeds out in every part of your life. So we need to start thinking about coercive control, the impact that it has on the wife and the children who had no idea. And of course, people say, oh, they must have known. Well, that's not always the case. These men are incredible manipulators and they are very devious. So like I said, they have rules and regulations. And I'm thinking about Peter Sutcliffe. He was married as well. And Colin Pitchfork. Colin Pitchfork actually had his baby with him when he abducted, strangled and raped and murdered Linda Mann. Just think about that. So I don't buy into this family man, and neither should you. In fact, we should be prioritising domestic abuse and domestic violence, particularly when there is coercive control. And the questions that we should ask should not be about physical abuse. It should be about coercive and controlling behaviour, the types of control, jealous-related behaviour. So these are the sorts of things where men just hide in plain sight. And I believe that Rex Heuermann was hiding in plain sight. And my colleague, Jim Clementi, I have to give him a shout out. We met many years ago at New Scotland Yard. He was working at the FBI. We've been colleagues and friends ever since. He wrote a profile back in 2011, and the New York Times featured that profile. And kudos to Jim, he nailed it. And he said things like he would be in his 40s, he would be meticulous in terms of his planning, that he may well be a professional man. He said it may well be seasonal. His wife and children may be going out of town when he's committing the offences. And Jim got it completely right. We understand this type of behaviour that to other people just seems incredibly bizarre. But the fact that he's an architect and hiding behind this professional veneer, well, that's important. The fact that he waited, his need-driven behaviour, it gets so much that he has to act out on it, but he had to wait and wait until his wife left town. And that's why women were going missing and being killed at certain times. And I suspect there are going to be many more cases as well. We will hear much more about other women who found him creepy and he did things that made them feel on edge and uncomfortable. And there will be other discoveries. He will have, like I said, storages or certain facilities in other places. There's a whole rich sexual fantasy world, a very concerning set of paraphilias here, and I'll get into that maybe in another episode. But I really can't emphasize enough the coercive control aspect to these individuals. They hide in plain sight. People might say, oh, he's a control freak, and he might be a control freak in certain areas of his life. If he wants to make money, he's going to be putting his time and energy into that, but he won't like to be challenged. He won't like his authority challenged, and the need to control and dominate will be pervasive. So the smouldering volcano is how the 0 to 60, the very quick fuse, is how people like him may well be described. When I was at New Scotland Yard, I wrote a paper, and it was very detailed, profiling 452 perpetrators, domestic violence perpetrators who raped their partners, but who also had seriously harmed their partners. And that's the piece of work where I found that 1 in 8 of them were very dangerous. And a large number of them are psychopaths, and they are harming other women outside the home. So we must make these links. That's where my risk assessment model came from. And I want to just also highlight to you that Dr. Robert Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, the PCLR revised for short, he in 1993 said in his research that 25% of domestic violence perpetrators were psychopaths. That is important to think about, right? And that's why I find most of the very dangerous perpetrators in the domestic violence domain. Now, he was finding that in 1993. This predates coercive control. So in all my cases, and I can only talk from my own experience, but serial killer cases and serial stranger rape cases, coercive control features in all of them. And I've collected a whole database of those individuals. I'm very interested to hear more about this particular case. I am very interested to hear what his wife may say. I have huge sympathy for what she and the children are going through. These selfish, entitled men think only of their own needs being met, and they now have this whole legacy of what he has created and then being known as being connected to him. And I should also say that he has said that he's not responsible for these cases, and I'm sure we're going to hear more. We'll hear more about him being charged with other murders. Serial killers like this don't just stop offending. So there's still a very rigorous investigation that is unfolding. A lot of this happens post-charge. So I'm thinking about all the victims. I'm thinking about their families at this time. And I also include his wife and children in that. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope this has been useful in explaining some of the behaviour and some of my research as well. So until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instinct.